I'm going to be quite brief talking about altmetrics because most people have already been mentioning altmetric. So they've kind of done my job for me. And talking about doing my jobs for me, these slides were prepared by my colleague Stacey Conkiel, who was very generously shared them with me before I came here. So altmetric, I'm sure you all know altmetrics. So this is the study, the collection, the presentation, the discovery of mentions and engagement, evidence of engagement for scholarly documents. And in these slides, we're going to be giving you some data, presenting some data on books, the sharing and the attention and the engagement of books and book chapters. And we've divided those two things up. Now, I was talking with Martijn earlier about the difference between the attention rates between whole books and with chapters. Now, clearly, because a book consists of many chapters, the number of chapters that we track is many more times than the number of books that we track. But what's really interesting to see is that it's actually a much higher proportion of books that get attention via altmetric. Now, we suspect, we haven't drilled into this data, but we're going to do that later. We suspect that this has a strong discipline relationship, simply because the chapters that are presented from collected works tend to fall into distinctive subject areas rather than they're not monographs. So we're going to look into that data later, I think. But it's kind of interesting to see that there is a continuing increase in the amount of attention that is being paid to book artifacts. The axes on these graphs are different, so don't fall into the trap of thinking that those are the same things. But they are the same shape. And what we see there is an accelerating interest in sharing of scholarly interest in scholarly books. Principally in Twitter. What's kind of interesting, generally speaking, for me, is that now that we are scraping book mentions from patents, that's probably our second biggest source of data in altmetric. So patents is an incredibly important source of data. And this graph is going to have new colors next time you see something like it. You'll have an orange color in there to represent patent mentions. So the increasing emphasis, the increasing sharing of scholarly information means that we have much better evidence to link funding decisions back through to the outputs that they are funded, and that includes the books. My particular interest is in what we can do with the qualitative information that comes out. As much as I love the fact that we can measure citations by the ton, getting evidence of impact through news articles and through policy papers is so very important for individual researchers. For example, I was talking with a Brazilian researcher last year, and she gave me a list of DOIs from outputs from various book programs that she was working on. And we found that the World Bank had cited one of those books in a report on domestic abuse. They would never have known that if they were just looking at citations. The book itself had no citations for the reasons I was discussing earlier. But for that book author to be able to give real serious evidence of their impact on a global scale, for me that was a really quite a moving moment. Those qualitative pieces of data are jewels, and we really can't discard them. So I am going to very briefly show you the geographical range. This is for book mentions rather than for chapter mentions. It is, of course, very centered around the USA. This is what you always see when you see volumes of Twitter. It's kind of interesting for me to see how much coverage of books there is in Russia. You don't normally see that kind of color of intensity coming from Russia. It's a very global map of interest. Certainly, and sadly, the Twitter map is somewhat obscured, but you see some really interesting countries in Asia that are mentioning books on Twitter. Chapters follows pretty much the same trend, and I'm just going to click through that. Policy is the thing that, as I was mentioning earlier, I get very interested about. So this is a heat map of books and chapters being mentioned in policy documents around the world. There is a reason why it is coloured the way that it is, and that is because scraping the mentions out of policy documents is incredibly hard. For example, if you try and scrape references out of documents that use a Cyrillic alphabet, it's a considerably harder effort to do. It takes much more processing power, and it requires a great deal of curation. That work that the investment that we've made in improving and building our policy scrapers is something which is ongoing. And over the course of the next couple of years, you're going to see these colours changing. That's more to do with our technology and our approach in the policy scraping improving. So one of the big takeaway for me really is that last one about the long tail. If you look at the volume of numbers, so often books pale into insignificance when you measure them against the millions and millions of articles that are published in journals. We really do need to assert that books have their own distinctive role to play in the scholarly ecosystem, and that we can't always make direct comparisons between books and articles and other kinds of artifacts. If we are to value that diversity, we need to recognize that context when we talk about books, when we talk about the activity. It's often said that books don't get very many citations, that books don't get very much altmetrics. And in terms of percentages, that's probably true. But when you look at them by themselves, you find really good quality evidence of the impact that books have on the scholarly world. Thank you.